The air in the terminal tasted of floor polish and stale coffee, a scent Elias Vance had come to associate with purgatory. He sat hunched on a hard plastic chair near gate C-27, a ghost in a worn wool coat that was too warm for the climate-controlled building. He had billions of dollars in his name, enough to buy this entire airport and the city it served, but he wore the frayed anonymity of his disguise like a shield. For 2 years, since the day the world had cracked open and swallowed everything he loved, he had been a man in hiding. Hiding from his name, from his reflection, from the crushing weight of a life that had continued when it should have stopped. His ticket was for seat 24B, a middle seat in the back of the plane, a place of maximum discomfort and minimal attention. It was a penance of sorts. He deserved no comfort. The boarding call for Flight 744 to Chicago echoed through the concourse, and he joined the slow, shuffling line of passengers, his head down, his gaze fixed on the scuffed toes of his boots. He was just another weary traveler, another face in the crowd. It was the only identity he could bear. On the plane, he walked past the plush, spacious seats of first class without a glance. He found his row and was about to slide into the cramped space allotted to him when he stopped. He looked forward, back toward the front of the plane. An impulse, sharp and sudden, seized him. It was not a logical thought, but a feeling, a deep, resonant pull from a part of himself he thought had died. He turned around. He walked back up the aisle, against the current of boarding passengers, ignoring the annoyed sighs and sideways glances. He stopped at seat 2A, a window seat in the first row. It was empty. He slid into the soft leather, the space an obscene luxury compared to the seat that was rightfully his. He didn't put his bag in the overhead compartment. He placed the worn canvas satchel on his lap, a barrier between himself and the world. He closed his eyes and waited. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but he knew this was a test for them, for himself. A flight attendant with a name tag that read Brenda and a smile as brittle as sponge sugar stopped beside his seat. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass?" Her voice was pitched to a frequency of forced politeness that grated on his nerves. Elias didn't open his eyes. "I don't have it out." "Well, I'm afraid I'll need to see it," she said, the smile tightening. "This is the first-class cabin." The implication was clear. "You don't belong here." He heard the rustle of her uniform as she shifted her weight, a sound of impatient authority. He felt the eyes of the other first-class passengers on him, the man in the $1,000 suit across the aisle, the woman with the perfectly coiffed hair. He could feel their judgment, a familiar, cold pressure. He finally opened his eyes and looked at her. He made sure his expression was blank, his gaze empty. The seat was empty. "That doesn't matter, sir. This seat is assigned to another passenger, or it's reserved. You'll need to move to the seat on your ticket." Brenda's voice lost its sugary coating, revealing a hard, unyielding core. "No," Elias said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between them with the weight of an anchor. Brenda's jaw tightened. "Sir, I'm not asking. You need to move to your assigned seat now, or I will have to call the gate agent to have you removed from the aircraft." It was in that moment that another voice, softer and calmer, joined the conversation. "Is there a problem here, Brenda?" Elias turned his head slightly. A second flight attendant had approached. Her name tag read Amelia. She was younger, with kind eyes that seemed to be taking in the whole situation, not just the surface-level infraction. She looked at Elias not with judgment, but with a flicker of curiosity. "This man is in the wrong seat, and he's refusing to move," Brenda said, her voice sharp with indignation. Amelia looked at Elias. She didn't see a problem, she saw a person. He could see it in the way her gaze softened. "Sir, the plane can't take off until everyone is in their assigned seat. Is there a reason you'd prefer to sit here?" Her question was a lifeline. It wasn't an order, it was an inquiry. It assumed he had a reason, that he wasn't just a troublemaker. It was the first time in 2 years anyone in a uniform had treated him like a human being with a story, instead of a problem to be managed. He thought about his real ticket for 24B, a seat number that held no significance. He thought about the seat his wife had been in, 14A, and his daughter, 14B. He had bought this entire airline, this collection of metal tubes that flew through the sky. Because of those two empty seats, he was testing its soul, and in this woman he saw the first glimmer of one. "I'd like that," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He pointed to the empty seat beside him, 2B. "I'd like to purchase this seat as well, if it's available." Brenda scoffed. "You can't just buy a first-class seat on the plane, sir. That's not how it works. Now, are you going to move or not?" "Let me check," Amelia said, pulling out a small device. Her fingers tapped on the screen. She looked at Elias, then back at the screen. "The seat is showing as available. I can't process a payment here, but perhaps we can sort it out. Why don't you stay here for a moment, sir, and I'll speak with the gate agent." She gave Brenda a look that was both placating and firm. It was a small act of grace, a simple choice to de-escalate, to offer a solution instead of a threat. It was everything he had been looking for. He watched her walk away, a small, determined figure moving toward the front of the plane. He had made a choice to sit down, to disrupt the clockwork of the system. Now, she had made a choice to meet his disruption, not with force, but with kindness. The test had begun, and the results were already more complicated than he had expected. Brenda stood her ground for another moment, her arms crossed, radiating disapproval. "You're causing a delay for everyone," she hissed, before turning on her heel and marching toward the galley, her back ramrod straight. The man in the expensive suit across the aisle shook his head and buried his nose in his financial newspaper, the moment of drama having passed. Elias leaned his head back against the seat and looked out the small, thick window at the flurry of activity on the tarmac. He felt a strange and unfamiliar sensation stirring in his chest. It was a faint, fragile thing, but he recognized it. It was the first flicker of hope he had felt in a very long time. Amelia returned a few minutes later, her expression calm and professional. "We can't process an upgrade on board once the doors are closed, sir," she explained quietly, kneeling slightly to be at his level. "But the purser has authorized you to remain in this seat for the flight. We can sort out the payment discrepancy when we land in Chicago." Elias just nodded, the mechanics of payment meaning nothing to him. What mattered was her. She had found a way. She had bent a rule, not for a wealthy man in a nice suit, but for a disheveled stranger who had given her nothing but trouble. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate. "It's no problem," she replied with a small, genuine smile. "Can I get you something to drink before we take off?" "Water? Orange juice?" Water would be fine. As she walked away to get it, Elias watched her, a complex knot of emotions tightening in his gut. He had come here to find the rot in the system, to confirm his belief that the company that had allowed his family's plane to fall from the sky was as hollow and heartless as he imagined. He had expected callousness, procedural rigidity, and a complete lack of empathy. He had found it in Brenda. But he had also found Amelia. She was an anomaly, a variable he hadn't accounted for, and she was changing the equation of his grief and his rage in a way that left him feeling profoundly unsettled. The plane pushed back from the gate and began its slow taxi toward the runway. Elias took the glass of water from Amelia, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. He felt a jolt, a spark of simple human contact that felt alien and overwhelming. He drank the water, the cold liquid, a shock to his system. For 2 years, he had been a ghost, observing the world through a thick pane of glass. Now, it felt as if someone had tapped on that glass, reminding him that he was still inside, still breathing. As the plane ascended, banking over the sprawling city, Elias stared out the window, his thoughts a turbulent storm. The acquisition of Apex Airlines had been a cold, calculated act of revenge. He had used a series of shell corporations and proxies, a silent, invisible coup. No one knew the new owner's identity. The board of directors, the CEO, the pilots, they only knew that a mysterious investor had bought a controlling interest and that changes were coming. He had planned to dismantle it piece by piece, to expose every shortcut, every safety violation, every instance of profit being placed before people. He wanted to ruin the men who had signed the memos that saved pennies on maintenance and cost him everything. But now, watching Amelia move through the cabin with an easy grace, he felt the cold certainty of his plan begin to thaw. She was part of this airline. She was one of the thousands of employees who would be affected by his crusade. Was it possible to burn down the temple without hurting the innocent people inside? The flight settled into its rhythm. The seatbelt sign pinged off. Amelia began the first-class service, her movements efficient and warm. She treated the man in the suit and the woman with the perfect hair with the same professional courtesy she showed him. There was no difference in her demeanor. When she came to him, she leaned in slightly. "Are you comfortable, sir? Can I get you anything else? A pillow? A blanket?" "No, thank you. This is fine," he said. He watched her interact with other passengers. He saw her help an elderly woman with her bag. He saw her patiently explain the entertainment system to a confused traveler. Each small act of kindness was a counterpoint to the bitterness that had been his only companion for so long. He had painted the entire airline with a single brush of corporate greed, but he was beginning to see the individual threads, the human components that made up the whole. A short while later, a young mother and her small daughter made their way up the aisle from the back of the plane, heading for the lavatory. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, had wide, curious eyes and a bright pink bow in her hair. She reminded him so painfully of his own daughter, Sarah, that he had to look away, a familiar ache seizing his chest. On their way back, the little girl stopped right beside his seat, her eyes fixed on him. Her mother gently tugged her hand. "Come on, Lily, let's not bother the man." But the girl didn't move. She just stared at Elias. "Why are you so sad?" she asked, her voice clear and high. The question was a punch to the gut. It was so direct, so innocent, so utterly devastating. Adults saw a scruffy man, a potential problem. This child saw the truth of him. The grief that was etched into the lines of his face. He didn't know how to answer. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Amelia, who was passing by, paused. She knelt down to the little girl's level. "That's a very thoughtful question, Lily," she said softly. "Sometimes grown-ups have a lot on their minds, and it can make them look sad even when they're not." She smiled at the girl, then glanced at Elias, her eyes full of a gentle understanding. She was protecting him, giving him an out. The mother, flustered and apologetic, pulled the girl away. "I'm so sorry," she murmured to Elias as they retreated back down the aisle. Elias was left reeling, the child's question echoing in his mind. "Why are you so sad?" "Because the world kept spinning. Because the sun still rose. Because planes like this one still flew through the sky as if nothing had happened." He leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the window, the vibration of the engines a low thrum against his skull. A few moments later, Amelia was back. She didn't say anything. She just placed a small cup of tea and a sealed package of shortbread cookies on the console next to him. "I thought this might help," she said quietly, and then she was gone, attending to other duties. He stared at the cup of tea. It was such a small gesture, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But it felt monumental. It was an act of unsolicited compassion. She hadn't been required to do it. It wasn't part of the service protocol. She had seen his distress and had responded to it. He picked up the cup, the warmth seeping into his cold hands. He took a sip. The tea was chamomile, calming and fragrant. He thought about his wife, how she used to make him tea just like this when he came home stressed from work. The memory was so vivid, so painful, that it brought tears to his eyes. He quickly blinked them away, ashamed of the sudden surge of emotion. For the rest of the flight, he and Amelia existed in a state of quiet awareness, He watched her work, and he felt her occasional glances in his direction. They didn't speak again until the plane began its descent into Chicago. She came through the cabin to collect cups and prepare for landing. When she got to his seat, she paused. "I hope the tea was all right," she said. "It was perfect," he replied, his voice low. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to tell her something, to explain himself, but he didn't know how. How could he explain the vast, empty chasm of his life to this kind stranger? How could he tell her that he owned her livelihood and was planning to destroy it? "My name is Elias," he said instead, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. He hadn't offered it to anyone in 2 years. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "It's nice to meet you, Elias. I'm Amelia." "I know," he said, then realized how that might sound. "I mean, from your name tag." She laughed softly. "Of course." She lingered for a moment longer than necessary. "You know, for what it's worth," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Whatever is making you sad, I hope it gets better." Her words were like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. They were so simple, so earnest. He felt the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart begin to crumble. This woman, with her quiet grace and profound empathy, was a direct threat to his mission of vengeance. She represented the very thing he was trying to prove didn't exist within this company: a genuine, beating human heart. The plane landed with a gentle bump, and as it taxied to the gate, the carefully controlled chaos of deplaning began. The other first-class passengers were already on their feet, grabbing their designer luggage, eager to get on with their important lives. Elias remained seated, a strange sense of inertia holding him in place. He knew what was coming. Brenda hadn't forgotten about him. He could see her speaking animatedly with the purser near the cockpit door. She kept glancing back at him, her expression a mixture of triumph and vindication. She was going to make sure he faced the consequences for his disruption. The seatbelt sign turned off. Amelia was busy near the exit, wishing passengers a good day. Elias watched her, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. The lie of his identity was about to collide with the reality of his power, and he was afraid that she would be caught in the wreckage. Brenda marched down the aisle, a gate supervisor in a crisp blue blazer in tow. She stopped at his row, her posture radiating smug authority. "Sir," she said loudly, ensuring everyone remaining could hear. "This is the station manager. You need to come with him. We have the issue of the unpaid fare for this seat to discuss, as well as the delay you caused to this flight." Elias didn't move. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. He could end this with a single sentence. He could reveal his name, watch the color drain from her face, and enjoy the petty satisfaction of her humiliation. But he looked past her, at Amelia, who had turned, and was now watching the scene with a worried expression. If he revealed himself now, he would become Mr. Vance, the billionaire owner. He would cease to be Elias, the sad man she had shown kindness to. He would lose that fragile, tentative connection, and the thought of that loss was suddenly unbearable. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," Elias said, his voice calm and steady. "There's no misunderstanding," the station manager said, his tone officious. "You occupied a seat you didn't pay for and refused to cooperate with the flight crew. That's a serious offense." The situation was escalating. A few passengers who were still in the aisle stopped to watch the unfolding drama. Amelia took a step forward, a look of concern on her face. "Mark, maybe we can discuss this privately," she said to the manager. "This is a security issue." "Amelia," Brenda cut in, shooting her a venomous look. "Stay out of it." It was then that the cockpit door opened. The captain, a man with silver hair and a distinguished authoritative air, stepped out. He surveyed the scene, his eyes landing on the small crowd gathered around seat 2A. "What's the problem here?" Captain Evans asked, his voice a calm baritone that commanded immediate respect. "Captain," Brenda said, practically preening with self-importance. This passenger refused to sit in his ticketed seat, caused a delay, and has been belligerent. We're having him removed." Captain Evans looked past Brenda, his gaze falling on Elias. For a moment, he just stared. Elias saw a flicker of confusion in the captain's eyes, followed by a sudden, dawning wave of recognition. The captain's professional mask slipped, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. His face went pale. He took a step forward, moving past the stunned station manager and the triumphant Brenda. He stopped directly in front of Elias. The entire cabin seemed to fall silent. "Waiting, Mr. Vance," the captain said, his voice barely a whisper. He cleared his throat and spoke again, his tone now filled with a mixture of deference and disbelief. "Mr. Vance, I had no idea you were on this flight. My apologies. Is everything to your satisfaction?" The name hung in the air, electric and heavy. Vance, Elias watched as the name rippled through the small audience. He saw the station manager's jaw drop. He saw Brenda's face transform, her smugness dissolving into a mask of horror as the reality of who she had been threatening crashed down upon her. But he wasn't looking at them. His eyes were fixed on Amelia. He watched her face. He saw the initial confusion, the furrow of her brow as she tried to place the name. Then he saw the moment of comprehension, her eyes widening in shock. But it wasn't just shock. He saw something else, something that felt like a physical blow. He saw hurt. He saw a flicker of betrayal. The kind, sad man she had shown compassion to was a lie. He was a fraud. He wasn't one of them, a regular person navigating the hassles of travel. He was the man at the very top, the invisible power who controlled their fates, and he had been playing a game with them. "Everything is fine, Captain," Elias said, his voice quiet, his gaze still locked on Amelia. He felt a chasm opening between them, wider and more impassable than the airplane aisle. "Thank you for your concern." The captain, still flustered, nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Vance, of course." He turned to the station manager and Brenda, his expression now thunderous. "My office." Now, Brenda looked as if she were about to faint. She cast one last, terrified glance at Elias before scurrying away after the captain and the shell-shocked manager. The remaining passengers, sensing the shift in power, quickly gathered their things and hurried off the plane, whispering amongst themselves. Within moments, the cabin was empty except for Elias and Amelia. The silence was deafening. He finally tore his gaze away from her and slowly stood up, his joints aching as if he had aged decades in the last few minutes. He picked up his worn satchel. "Amelia," he began, but his voice failed him. She finally looked at him, her face a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality. The warmth was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cool, distant politeness that was more painful than any anger could have been. "Is there anything else I can assist you with, Mr. Vance?" she asked, her voice formal and crisp. The use of his last name was a deliberate choice, a wall she had just erected between them. He was no longer Elias. He was the owner, the boss, the lie. "Please, don't," he said, his voice pleading. "I can explain." "There's nothing to explain, sir," she said, her tone unwavering. "You're the owner of this airline. You're entitled to sit wherever you like. I apologize for the confusion my colleague caused." She was reciting a script, her words devoid of the genuine emotion that had defined her every action before. She had retreated back into the safety of her role, a flight attendant serving a first-class passenger. "It wasn't about the seat," he said, taking a step toward her. "It was a test. I needed to see—" "A test?" She interrupted him, and for the first time, a flash of her true feelings broke through the professional veneer. A spark of anger ignited in her eyes. "Was I part of the test, Mr. Vance? Was my kindness part of your experiment? Were you taking notes on whether the staff would treat a poorly dressed man with basic human decency?" Her questions hit their mark. each one a perfectly aimed dart. He flinched. Because, in a way, she was right. He had been testing her, and the thought now filled him with a profound sense of shame. "No," he said, but the words sounded weak, unconvincing even to his own ears. "It wasn't like that. It was more complicated." "I'm sure it was," she said, her voice flat. She turned away from him and began methodically checking the empty seats, her movements sharp and precise. It was a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. Elias stood there for a long moment, the worn strap of his satchel clutched in his hand. He had won. He had acquired the company. He had the power to enact his revenge, to burn it all to the ground. But standing in the empty cabin of the plane, faced with the cold disappointment in this one woman's eyes, he had never felt more defeated. He had found the one thing he hadn't known he was looking for, a flicker of genuine human connection, only to extinguish it with the truth of who he was. He turned and walked off the plane, the silence of the jet bridge echoing the vast emptiness that had just reopened inside him. He was Mr. Vance, the powerful, enigmatic billionaire. And he was utterly, completely alone. He spent the next few hours in a sterile airport conference room, the necessary evil of his position. The CEO of Apex, a man named Gerald Corbin, had been summoned. Corbin was a man Elias knew only from paperwork and shareholder reports, a man whose signature was on the cost-cutting memos that had sealed his family's fate. He entered the room sweating, his face a mask of panicked obsequiousness. "Mr. Vance, a profound apology for the incident on the flight. I assure you the employee in question has been dealt with," Corbin began, his voice slick with false sincerity. "Brenda?" Elias asked, his voice flat. "Yes, her employment has been terminated, effective immediately. We have a zero-tolerance policy for disrespecting our premium customers." A cold fury washed over Elias. "You fired her?" "Of course. Immediately. We cannot have that kind of behavior representing Apex Airlines." Elias stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the planes on the tarmac. "You fired her for following the rules you wrote, Corbin. She saw a man in a seat he hadn't paid for, and she enforced company policy. The only mistake she made was her lack of grace. You, on the other hand, fired her not to uphold a standard, but to save your own skin. Reinstate her." Immediately, Corbin stammered, completely thrown. "But, Mr. Vance, reinstate her," Elias repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "And then, I want a full, unredacted report on every maintenance check, every parts supplier contract, and every safety audit for the last 5 years on my desk by morning. Everything." He left Corbin sputtering in the conference room and made his way through the airport. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sense of victory, just a hollow, aching void. He had intended to be a wraith, a force of righteous destruction. But the encounter with Amelia had changed him. It had reminded him of his own humanity, and in doing so, had made the prospect of pure destruction feel ugly and wrong. His mind kept replaying the hurt in her eyes. He had used her kindness as a barometer, and it felt like a betrayal of the highest order. He found himself at another gate, watching another plane being prepared for departure. He saw the flight crews moving with practiced efficiency, the ground crew loading baggage. They were all just people, doing their jobs, caught in a system far larger than themselves. He had wanted to punish the system, but he was beginning to realize that the system was made of people like Amelia. He spent the night in a nondescript hotel room, the unredacted reports he had demanded already flooding his encrypted laptop. He read through them, page after page of technical jargon and budgetary line items. And he found it. The rot was there, just as he had suspected. A pattern of choosing cheaper, uncertified parts for routine engine maintenance. A series of delayed safety upgrades. Memos signed by Corbin, praising regional managers for cutting costs. It was all there in black and white, the evidence he needed to destroy them. But as he stared at the screen, he didn't feel the expected surge of vindication. All he could see was Amelia's face, her expression of disappointment. He saw the little girl, Lily, asking him why he was so sad. He realized that destroying the company wouldn't bring his family back. It wouldn't fill the void. It would just create more chaos, hurt more innocent people, and leave him just as alone as he was before. He closed the laptop. The path of destruction he had mapped out for himself now seemed like a dead end. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of his own making. The power he had amassed felt like a curse, a heavy weight that isolated him from the world. He collapsed onto the bed, the sterile silence of the hotel room pressing in on him. This was his darkest moment. He had everything he thought he wanted: the power, the proof, the means for revenge, and it all meant nothing. He had been cast out not by others, but by his own actions. The one person who had seen through his disguise had rejected him, and he believed, with a crushing certainty, that she was right to do so. He was unworthy of the kindness she had shown him. He was just a ghost, haunted by the past and haunting the present. Sleep offered no escape, only fragmented dreams of falling. He woke before dawn, the gray light filtering through the cheap hotel curtains. For a moment, he considered just disappearing again, letting the shell corporations run the airline into the ground. A slow, anonymous revenge. He could retreat back to his self-imposed exile, back to the comfortable numbness of his grief. It would be easy. But then, the image of Amelia's face surfaced in his mind again. Not the hurt, disappointed look from the plane, but the earlier one. The one filled with gentle understanding when the little girl had called him sad. The quiet compassion when she had brought him the cup of tea. That was the person he had betrayed. That was the person he couldn't forget. Her simple decency was a beacon in the fog of his rage. He thought about her words, "I hope it gets better." It was a choice. He could stay in the darkness, or he could try to find the light. He got out of bed, a new fragile resolve beginning to form. Revenge was a dead end, destruction was empty, but perhaps he could build something instead. He showered and dressed, not in the worn-out clothes of his disguise, but in a simple, clean shirt and trousers from the bag he always carried, but never used. He looked at himself in the mirror. The sadness was still there in his eyes, a permanent shadow. But for the first time in 2 years, he saw a flicker of something else. Purpose. He made a call. Not to a lawyer, not to a corporate raider, but to the head of operations at the airport. His request was unusual, but his name now carried an authority that no one dared question. An hour later, he was standing on the tarmac as Flight 714 was being prepared for its return journey to the coast. He saw the flight crew boarding, and his heart hammered against his ribs. He saw her. Amelia, she was walking with the rest of the crew, her expression professional, a little weary. She hadn't seen him yet. He didn't know what he was going to say. "I'm sorry" felt too small. "I'm a broken man who just lost his way" felt too self-indulgent. He just knew he had to try. He had to bridge the chasm he had created. As the crew neared the plane, one of the pilots saw him and stopped short, nudging the captain. Captain Evans saw him and immediately changed course, walking toward him, his expression a mixture of apprehension and respect. This drew the attention of the rest of the crew. Amelia looked up. She saw the captain walking toward the strange, solitary figure on the tarmac. And then she recognized him, Elias, Mr. Vance. She stopped in her tracks, her flight bag slipping from her shoulder. Her face was a blank canvas, impossible to read. "Mr. Vance," Captain Evans said, reaching him, "is there something we can do for you?" Elias didn't take his eyes off Amelia. "I need to speak with your flight attendant," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the noisy tarmac. With Amelia, all eyes turned to her. She looked trapped, a deer caught in the headlights. He saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. This was a terrible idea, a public spectacle. He was using his power again, forcing a confrontation she clearly didn't want. He was failing already. But then, something extraordinary happened. As he stood there, bracing for her to turn away, a sudden commotion erupted near the gate. A medical team was rushing through the door, pushing a gurney. There were shouts. A child was in distress. Elias's blood ran cold. He saw the mother from his flight, her face streaked with tears, running alongside the gurney. And on it, looking small and terrifyingly still, was Lily. Without a second thought, both he and Amelia forgot their own drama and ran toward the scene. They reached the gurney at the same time. The little girl was struggling to breathe, her face pale, her lips tinged with blue. What happened? Amelia asked the frantic mother, her training kicking in instantly. Her asthma, she has a severe allergy. I gave her the shot from her kit, but it's not working. Her inhaler is empty. I thought I had another one. The mother sobbed, her words tumbling out in a rush of panic. The paramedic was trying to administer oxygen, but the girl's airways were closing. We need to get her to the hospital now, but we're losing time. Her pulse is dropping. Elias felt a terrifying sense of déjà vu, the helplessness, the feeling of life slipping away. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't powerless. He pulled out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen. He bypassed every normal channel, his thumbprint authorizing access to a secure network. He wasn't thinking like a grieving man anymore. He was thinking like the man who commanded a global empire of logistics, technology, and transport. What's the best pediatric trauma center in this city? He demanded of the paramedic. Mercy General, but it's 20 miles away. In this traffic, it could be 40 minutes, the paramedic said, his focus entirely on the child. Get me the tower supervisor. Elias barked into the phone to his assistant on the other end of the line. Now, and get me Dr. Heiress Thorne at the Thorne Institute. Tell him it's a code Vance. Amelia was at the little girl's side, holding her hand, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice. Stay with us, Lily. You're being so brave. We're going to help you. She was a pillar of calm in the storm of chaos. Her focus, absolute. Within seconds, a voice crackled on Elias's phone. It was the tower supervisor. Clear a flight path from the executive heliport on the south side of the field to Mercy General Hospital, Elias commanded. I want air traffic cleared. No delays. A medevac chopper is being dispatched to that location. It will be there in 3 minutes. Have a vehicle ready to transport this team to the heliport now. He disconnected, and immediately the phone rang again. It was the world-renowned specialist, Dr. Thorne. Elias put him on speaker. Heiress, I have a 5-year-old female, acute anaphylactic shock, complicated by asthma, non-responsive to a standard epinephrine injection. The local team is with her now. He held the phone out to the paramedic, who, after a moment of stunned hesitation, began rattling off Lily's vitals and the treatments he had administered. As the doctor on the phone gave a series of rapid, complex instructions, Elias saw a black SUV speeding across the tarmac toward them. Let's go, Elias said, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument. The chopper is waiting. They loaded Lily, the frantic mother, and the medical team into the vehicle. Elias started to get in, then paused and looked at Amelia. She was still standing there, her face a mixture of awe and confusion. Come with me, he said. It wasn't an order. It was a plea. Please. She looked at her flight crew, at the plane she was supposed to be on. Captain Evans just nodded at her, his expression one of profound respect. She hesitated for only a second before climbing into the SUV beside him. The drive across the airfield was a blur. The helicopter was waiting, its rotors already spinning. They transferred Lily carefully. The mother, Amelia, and Elias climbed in behind her. As the chopper lifted off, banking sharply over the airport, Elias finally met Amelia's gaze. The mask was gone. The hurt, the anger, the professional distance, it had all been stripped away by the raw, terrifying urgency of the moment. All he saw in her eyes now was a deep, unguarded humanity. She had seen him not as Mr. Vance, the cold billionaire, and not as Elias, the sad fraud. She had seen him as a man who would move heaven and earth to save a child. In the roar of the helicopter blades, in the desperate fight for a little girl's life, he was finally, truly himself. And she was seeing him. They landed on the roof of Mercy General Hospital in record time. A team of doctors, prepped by Heiress Thorne's call, was waiting. They whisked Lily away into the emergency room. Elias, Amelia, and Lily's mother were left in a sterile, white waiting room, the sudden silence a stark contrast to the preceding chaos. Lily's mother was shaking, trying to fill out paperwork with trembling hands. Amelia sat with her, speaking in a low, comforting voice, helping her with the forms, getting her a cup of water. She was no longer a flight attendant, she was simply a kind person in a crisis. Elias stood by the window, watching the city lights begin to glitter in the twilight. He had used his power, the very thing that had isolated him, to do something unequivocally good. He hadn't thought about revenge, or profit, or strategy. He had only thought about that little girl. And it felt right. It felt like breathing again after holding his breath for 2 years. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor came into the waiting room. "She's stabilized," the doctor said, a tired smile on her face. "Her airway is secure. The quick transport made all the difference. You got her here just in time." Lily's mother collapsed in a chair, sobbing with relief. Amelia put a comforting arm around her. Elias felt the tension drain out of him, leaving him weak-kneed. He turned from the window and looked at Amelia. She was watching him, her expression soft. He walked over to her. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For what you did. For her." "You're the one who called the helicopter," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. "I just made some calls," he said, shaking his head. "You were the one who was human." He took a deep breath. It was time. No more hiding. "My wife and daughter, they died in a plane crash 2 years ago. An Apex flight. That's why I bought the company. I wanted to, I don't know, punish them. I wanted to burn it all down." He finally said the words out loud, and the confession was both a burden and a release. He saw a flicker of understanding, of deep empathy in her eyes. The judgment he had feared wasn't there. "I'm so sorry, Elias," she said, and she used his name. "It was a gift. I can't even imagine. Sitting on that plane, I was looking for proof that the whole company was heartless," he continued, his voice low. "And then I met you. You were kind to me when you had no reason to be. You showed compassion to a difficult stranger. You ruined my whole plan." He managed a weak, sad smile. "And then today, seeing you with Lily, seeing what I could do with the power I have, I realized I was wrong. Tearing things down is easy. Building something better, that's the hard part. That's what matters." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "I don't want to be Mr. Vance, the ghost in the machine. I want to be Elias. And I want to make this right. I want to rebuild this airline from the inside out. I want to make it the safest, most compassionate airline in the world. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who understands what that means. I need someone who remembers that we're not transporting cargo, we're transporting people's lives, their families." He paused, his next words the most terrifying and hopeful he had spoken in years. "I need you, Amelia." She stared at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the truth of his pain, the sincerity of his words. The walls between them, built of lies and power and grief, finally came down. "Okay, Elias," she said softly. "Okay." 1 year later, the world of aviation was talking about the Apex miracle. The airline, once a symbol of corporate indifference, had been radically transformed. Under the direct leadership of its mysterious owner, Elias Vance, and a newly appointed vice president of in-flight experience and safety, Amelia Hayes. The company had become a model of innovation and compassion. Every plane in the fleet was retrofitted with state-of-the-art medical equipment, far exceeding industry standards. A new training program, designed by Amelia herself, focused on empathy and crisis management, empowering flight crews to prioritize passengers over protocol. They established the Lilly Fund, a charitable foundation funded by a percentage of every first-class ticket, dedicated to providing medical travel for critically ill children. Elias was no longer a ghost. He was a visible, active leader, but he never moved into the lavish corporate headquarters. He and Amelia ran the company from a modest office at the main hub, their door always open. He was still a quiet man, the sadness still a shadow in his eyes, but it was no longer the all-consuming darkness it had once been. It was now a part of him, a source of profound empathy that fueled his new purpose. One sunny afternoon, he stood with Amelia on an observation deck, watching the planes take off and land. They were holding hands, their fingers intertwined comfortably. He watched a family with small children laughing as they boarded a plane, and he felt not a pang of his old grief, but a quiet sense of peace. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked her. "Flying? Being up there?" Amelia leaned her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But the work we're doing here, it feels like we're helping every single flight, not just one at a time. This is where I'm supposed to be." He turned to her, a genuine smile gracing his lips. He had spent 2 years lost in the past, consumed by an ending. But this woman, with her simple, unwavering kindness, had shown him the way to a new beginning. He had boarded her flight a broken man on a mission of revenge. He had deplaned with a new mission, a new purpose, and the tentative hope of a shared future. He had learned that true power wasn't the ability to destroy, but the courage to rebuild. "I'm where I'm supposed to be too," he said, his voice full of a gratitude that was deeper than the sky. He squeezed her hand, and together they watched another plane ascend, carrying its precious cargo of human lives safely toward the horizon. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Elias Vance was looking forward to the destination.